and they're paying that price. Smithfield Foods isn't paying it, or Tyson or anyone else. The consumer is paying it. That's what vertical integration does. Right now, we've got our eggs, our poultry, our hogs, all vertically integrated very nicely, and we're working on the cattle and the dairy. That's getting under control too by big money interests. Yeah, get big or get out. Who said that?
Was that Earl Butts?
Yeah, Earl Butts.
Secretary of Ag.
Mhm.
Plant fence row to fence row, fellas.
Yep.
The world is our market. Yeah. It's not our market. It's ADM's market. That's who it is. It's not ours. ADM was the grocery store to the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are we then?
I don't know. Chopped liver.
Chopped liver.
From the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, I'm Lily Richard, and this is part 2 of a 4-part podcast series, How to Fight a Factory Farm. Since the 1980s, animal agriculture in the U.S. has undergone a major transformation, with the majority of livestock rearing moving from smaller, diversified family farms across the countryside into much larger, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, aka factory farms. In our first episode, we talked about what a factory farm is and touched on just a few of the immediate harms of these facilities. Unsurprisingly, packing thousands of animals and their millions of gallons of waste into confined and minimally regulated facilities has been a disaster for water and air pollution, animal welfare, and a threat to human health. But these devastating impacts are considered externalities, meaning they're costs that don't show up on the balance sheets of the big meat companies who benefit from the CAFO model. For these companies, the argument for CAFOs is their so-called efficiency. And it's true that factory farms have allowed more animals to be raised in less space and with less labor. For the big meat and dairy companies, that means lower costs and more profit to be captured. But for the people who live in farming communities, it means the loss of jobs, farms, and small businesses that were vital to once functional, vibrant rural economies. In this episode, we'll cover some of the history and economics of the CAFO system and the price we pay for factory farms.
My name is Rhonda Perry. I'm a livestock and grain farmer in Howard County, Missouri, and the executive director of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. I'm a fifth-generation farmer, actually, from Missouri. All of the generations of the Perrys live in one county. I live 3 counties over, so I made the big move to Howard County from Livingston County. I currently live on an 830-acre farm. We raise corn, soybeans, wheat, and cattle. We're in the process of sort of transitioning some of that production to our nephew, who's a young farmer with a young family just getting started in agriculture. Well, really, let me step back and just say, farming is an incredible livelihood, and farmers have to be so many things. So we are the caretakers of the animals. We have to be veterinarians. We have to be economists. We have to be soil scientists. We have to predict the weather, which, of course, no one really can do. And in some ways, we have to be big risk takers. We have to, it is not for the faint of heart. Obviously, we need to be able to survive and make money. And I want to talk a bit about some of the policies that we think would help us do that. But also it's about the passion. It's about being part of our local communities. It's about what we contribute to our farm and to the environment and really to the families that will come after us.
Like IATP and several other organizations in the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, Missouri Rural Crisis Center was founded in response to the farm crisis of the 1980s.
But one of the things that happened just after we were coming out of sort of that crisis, which we've never fully recovered from. And you can see that from the rural communities that we look at today. But one of the things that started happening very soon in the late 80s in Missouri was really the beginning of the corporatization of the hog industry in particular, which for Missouri started to hit around 1989 when Premium Standard Farms came to Missouri.
When Rhonda refers to corporatization, it's because the CAFO system isn't just about factory farms. It's about integrators, usually meatpacking companies, controlling as much of the supply chain as possible. Vertical integration is key to why it's so hard for independent farmers to compete in today's marketplace, and why producers who switch to the CAFO model end up trapped in it, and why the destructiveness of factory farms goes well beyond their immediate impacts. The roots of the problem go way back. In the 1800s, as railroads and refrigeration made it possible for meat to be transported beyond local markets, and more Americans began moving into cities, meatpacking companies, who controlled the growing slaughterhouses and packing facilities, began to play a larger role in the livestock and poultry industries. These companies were a problem from the beginning, attempting to reduce their costs through famously exploitative and abusive labor conditions in their meatpacking plants, but also by things like price fixing and fraud, taking advantage of both consumers and farmers in their supply chains. These issues resulted in the Packers and Stockyards Act being passed in 1921, an attempt to regulate the big meat packers and prevent anti-competitive behavior. But over the years, as meatpackers and other large food and agriculture companies grew and exerted pressure on policymakers, enforcement of antitrust laws and other regulation went out of fashion. In the 1970s, U.S. farm policy began explicitly favoring the production model favored by big agribusiness, including incentivizing specialization and the overproduction of commodities, which would lead to a glut of cheap corn and soy that could be used for below-cost animal feed. It also led to the farm crisis of the 1980s. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. CAFOs, and the vertical integration that comes along with them, started with chickens. In the 1920s and 30s, the discovery of vitamin D and other advances in animal husbandry technology allowed chicken farmers to move production indoors and start squeezing larger and larger flocks into their barns. Big poultry companies like Tyson began to buy up businesses all along the supply chain so they could profit from the farmers sourcing chicks, buying feed, and processing their birds. Soon, they were placing farmers under strict contracts dictating the breed, feed, and price paid for grown chickens. By the mid-1960s, according to nationalchickencouncil.org, 90% of broiler chickens in the U.S. came from integrated operations. But until the 1990s, most hogs, cattle, and dairy still came from independent producers, supported by a relatively functional, competitive marketplace. Here's Rhonda again.
Throughout my childhood, we raised hogs my whole childhood. That's what we did. And hogs have been considered mortgage lifters because if you stayed in hogs, you could make money. You didn't have to own hundreds of acres or thousands of acres like with cattle. You didn't have to have huge buildings and equipment. You didn't even have to have transportation, really. There were entire jobs that were made up of the hauling, feeder pig haulers and fat hog haulers, like all along the economic system of the pork industry were people who were able to make money, from the people who were the purebred breeders, to the people who were raising feeder pigs, to the people who were actually buying feeder pigs and feeding them out, to the people who were driving the trucks and the transportation, to the folks who were running all of the marketplaces. And there were tons of them all around the Midwest. I would say we probably had like 5 or 6 markets within just maybe 20 miles of us, maybe even 15 miles of us. So it was a competitive, functioning marketplace. Every day, my dad would come in and call the different buying stations and the auctions, find out what the price was. We could choose. Whoever was offering the highest price, we would set up a delivery date and we could make delivery. And that's what thousands of hog farmers did here in Missouri and throughout the Midwest, where there was competition. And what that meant was you need to be a really good hog producer because you could get benefits. You could get higher prices for higher quality hogs. It's like we had a vested interest in having healthy, quality animals that we could deliver in a timely way. We knew how we took care of them. We knew how fast they would gain weight. We knew we can't control everything. We can't control the weather, but we can definitely control the inputs, how we take care of our animals, the veterinarian supplies we're going to need. And I mean, independent family farm hog producers, they were the best at what they did. And the ones who did it great got premiums. And therefore, we were able to keep that money circulating in our local economies and in our communities.
But in the 1980s, throughout the farm crisis, CAFOs and vertical integration started making their way into the hog industry, starting with Smithfield in the southeast and moving into the Midwest. In Missouri, that was led by Premium Standard Farms in 1989, backed by $800 million from Morgan Stanley.
Which meant they had to change the anti-corporate farming law in Missouri, which they did in the middle of the night on the last day of legislative session. And what happened was the way that the hog industry was always historically stabilized was people who were jumping in and out. But Premium Standard Farms came in, they started with 0 sows. They ended up with 105,000 sows. But this put 2.5 million hogs on the marketplace nationally, which totally flooded the market and ultimately drove prices down for them as well, but also for the thousands of independent hog farmers who were out here producing. But that system of production, you can't jump in and out. You've just spent millions of dollars that you got from Wall Street creating this entire building and lagoon system and literally a factory system of production. So you can't just be, well, got to get out. There's too many hogs on the market. What you know is that you have to be the last one standing.
As we know, the factory farm situation just to the north in Iowa was also heating up around this time. Here's Barb Kalbach from Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, who we heard from in episode 1.
In the late 90s, this guy came to our house and he wanted to talk to us about putting up a confined animal feeding operation. So he's talking to me. He's describing, what they would do. They would build the building. All right. No, I'd build the building. Yeah. I get to build the building. Well, how much is that going to cost me? And they'd bring the hogs out and we'd get to raise them. And I'd said, well, when they go to market, then how much do we get per hog? And he said, $5. Real cheerfully, he said that. Real cheerful, $5. And I go, $5? In my head, I'm going, $5.
Barb turned down the offer, but not everyone did. Meat and dairy companies will often tout that they source from so-called family farms. And it's true that while some CAFOs are directly owned by the company, many are technically owned by farmers who chose to get big rather than get out. But while farmers take on all of the risks and costs of running a factory farm, the integrators are really in control, dictating exactly how the animals will be raised and how much they can be sold for. Here's Tim Gibbons, also from the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, or MRCC.
Yeah, the CAFO model, specifically the production contract model, and that's one in which the farmer or operator owns everything except for the livestock. And the livestock, let's just say hogs, are owned by the corporation. It's called chickenization because this is how the chicken industry does it. It's a brilliant system for the corporations because all the liability is pushed off of them. So the operator and the taxpayer has the loan and the debt. They own the waste. They own the dead hogs. They own the possible nuisance lawsuits from, farmer neighbors who have been there for generations. And you just put up a, 10,000 head sow operation next to them. So hog farmers used to be called inners and outers. Hog farmers would jump in the market when the price was high and the supply was low. And they would jump out of the market when prices were low because the supply was high. because hogs flipped pretty quickly. And that was a self-regulating marketplace. And hogs were called mortgage lifters. You didn't need a lot of land. Hogs flipped fast. You could make money off them, and you could pay off your farm. What happened in the 90s with industrialization and vertical integration was they started producing huge factory farms, concentrated animal feeding operations. What that did was the entities and the individuals that started the factory farm system, they had huge amount of debt. They build big buildings. They put hogs in these buildings. Oftentimes the corporation owns the hogs through production contracts. But what happened was that created overproduction because you couldn't get in and out because you had to pay off that loan. And when you have overproduction, that drives the price down. And when you drive it below the cost of production, that kicked all the independent producers out of the business because they couldn't make money on hogs anymore. So, for example, in the mid 1980s, we had 23,000 hog producers in Missouri. 90% of those were put out of business in one generation. But it's not just over 20,000 hog producers that were put out of business. It's a lot of small independent businesses on rural main streets that supported independent hog production that were also negatively impacted and put out of business. And one example is small meatpacking plants.
Now, the options for most hog farmers have been narrowed down to a handful of large processing facilities owned by the biggest meat companies, Tyson, Smithfield, JBS, who give preference to their own contract factory farmers. And as Main Street businesses and well-paying rural jobs dry up, these corporate meatpacking facilities aren't exactly providing community-sustaining jobs. Workers at meat processing plants are underpaid and work in some of the country's most dangerous working conditions. Meatpackers often hire immigrants or refugees for these jobs, whose vulnerable legal status makes it more difficult for them to organize labor unions or access other protections. Another consequence of the inflexible, consolidated factory farm model reared its head at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. When workers at the corporate meat processing plants fell ill and the facilities had to be closed for a number of weeks, it created a massive bottleneck of hogs waiting to be slaughtered because there were almost no smaller processing facilities left to pick up the slack.
Well, the problem with that was they had 20,000 head of hogs coming out of CAFOs ready to butcher every day, which is 100,000 head a week. Well, they're all ready to be butchered. Now, if that had happened and it was a whole bunch of farmers that supplied these in small groups, what a farmer would do would be to just slow their feed intake down a little bit and hang on to them until this crisis passed. But they couldn't do that. You want to know why? Because there were 20,000 baby pigs all born in that other big building down the street that are ready to step into the footprints of the 20,000 fat hogs that were going to slaughter. So they couldn't. There was no flexibility whatsoever. So what they did was kill the fat hogs by the tens of thousands. And they did that while people were standing in line clear across the United States for food because they didn't have any work because we were all shut down. So we're killing our meat production while everybody else is going without food. Now, who controls this? Smithfield does. Tyson does. So who is making the decision about who eats and who doesn't? Because you can bet that the guy that runs Smithfield Food ate, and he probably had his pork chops.
This situation was created by a consolidated meat industry, and that situation was created by policy. As a handful of meat companies gobbled up suppliers over the past few decades, the government largely stood by and watched.
So in the 80s, let's go back to the 80s, there was a big change in antitrust policy. Antitrust historically has been reacting and being a referee in competition in markets. So the goal of antitrust regulation is to ensure that there are open, fair, and competitive markets. What happened in the 80s was, specifically under Reagan, was to change the definition of antitrust from competition in markets to what's called the consumer welfare standard. And what that does is it allows corporations, when they're merging, to go to the regulators and pay for a study to be produced, really, that says that mergers are going to be good for consumers, the consumer welfare standard. And then they allow the merger to go through. The hog industry is a perfect example of that. And right now we have 4 corporations controlling over 70% of the U.S. hog industry.
The consumer welfare standard allows mergers to go through on the condition that they will not increase prices for consumers, ignoring the inevitable consequences for farmers, workers, jobs, small businesses, local economies, animal welfare, the environment. The list goes on. As it turns out, this standard doesn't necessarily protect consumers either. As control over the food system has consolidated among a handful of powerful companies, prices have gone up, and often quality has gone down. The difference is, this translates to more profits captured directly by the large meat and dairy companies, rather than income for farmers and other workers distributed along the supply chain and throughout rural economies. And farmers and organizers who were around in the 80s and 90s when CAFOs began to proliferate saw all of this coming. In 1995, the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment was formed and met with then Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman. MRCC's Rhonda Perry was there.
These were our demands to Secretary Glickman. Among other demands, stop mega mergers in the food and agriculture industry, strengthen and enforce the antitrust laws, specifically the Packers and Stockyards Act, to stop unfair, deceptive, and discriminatory packer practices. Stop corporate meat packers for paying more for the same quality of hog to their corporate allies. Stop meat packers from owning livestock. Stop using taxpayer dollars to subsidize the industrialization of the livestock industry, including through guaranteed and direct loans, and require meat packers to trade their contracts on an open, fair, and competitive marketplace using set prices versus formula-based prices. Those were the demands specifically related to USDA. Unfortunately, those are some of the same demands that we are making today because they did not take that opportunity when they could have actually impacted the pork industry in a very meaningful way.
The Secretary of Agriculture did not listen. In fact, the impacts of NAFTA and the 1996 Farm Bill pushed feed crop prices even lower, creating the conditions for factory farms to expand even more through the 90s and today, including into the beef and dairy industries. Even today, our Farm Bill and U.S. taxpayers continue to subsidize factory farms, both indirectly through the underpriced corn and soy used for feed, and directly through government-backed loans and conservation programs that, ironically, are meant to improve the environmental sustainability of farming practices.
One thing we know is that the corporate model and the industrialization of the hog industry and the livestock industry in specific would not look the way it looks without huge taxpayer backing. So we are paying for it. First off, we're paying for it through guaranteed loans, through FSA guaranteed loans to put these hog barns up or these livestock operations up. A lot of these operations go and get NRCS EQIP contracts, conservation contracts that deal with CAFO waste. NRCS is the conservation department within USDA, and EQIP is the environmental quality incentives program. We could go into EQIP, how that got changed from a real conservation program to, and it's still doing some good things. I mean, we work on the state technical committee. We know what EQIP does, but they also help manage waste for factory farms, which isn't conservation. It's just trying to figure out how to, have the taxpayer pay for factory farms. Below cost of production grain, not having supply management, allowing these commodities to be oftentimes below cost of production is also then a giveaway for the inputs for the factory farm system. We've got trade agreements that are being pushed and written by corporations at the expense of farmers and consumers and our environment and our economies, not only in our country, but around the world. The more power corporations get over our democratic process, the more power they can create for themselves over the market. The more power they create for themselves over the market, the more power they can create within the democratic process. So it like builds upon itself. And then all of a sudden they're the only ones talking.
As the power of these big ag corporations has grown, rural economies have paid the price. Here's Barb again, along with Hugh Espey, another organizer with ICCI.
I just remember the little towns were always busy. Like some of those towns up there had a lot going on with businesses that supported the farmers who lived in the area. Well, now you don't need very many farmers because you have all that livestock being raised in confinement. And so you don't have the businesses and the bustle in the small towns that you used to have. And I was in near Iowa Falls not too long ago, and I couldn't believe the change in that town. There was nothing there but the Veterans of Foreign Wars place. So I don't know if they even had a grocery store for sure. That was at Alden.
When you have the hog industry controlled by just a few people, so rather than having like 30 or 35,000 independent family farm hog producers across the state doing it, you have like 7,000, but they're all controlled by corporations. When you have that kind of consolidation, then you don't have, the vets, they go. The feed stores, all of those businesses that feed into that, family farm hog production system are gone. Mm-hmm. And like Barb says, and so there's that hollowing out. People leave.
I like to give the example of a square mile. And on our square mile, growing up, when Jim was growing up, there was 6 families on that square mile, and they all farmed, and they all raised a few head of livestock, of the hogs, the cattle, the chickens, and the dairy cows. And they all got their supplies in the nearby town. And if you had to fix something, if something broke, you went to the store and got one in the small town. You got your feed there. You had your veterinarian there. You got your repairs there. And so all those businesses were running to support all those farms on those square miles. Well, now there is one farmer on our square mile, and his name is Jim Kalbach. He's related to me. And we don't have livestock. So that shows you where all the businesses went. Now you're talking, if you think about it, you're talking about revenue for those towns, tax revenue and spending that used to go on in those small towns isn't happening anymore. And it shows in the small towns.
Without the jobs and tax revenue that these businesses once provided, you see even more ripple effects on rural towns. Closing schools, hospitals, community centers, churches. Rural Americans feel understandably abandoned. But their story isn't over. In many places, rural development and local food initiatives are doing the hard work of rebuilding rural economies and communities. And even as the push for CAFO expansion continues, the people living in factory farm country have not resigned themselves to polluted water, unbearable odors, and economic exploitation. On the next episode of How to Fight a Factory Farm, a community fights back. How to Fight a Factory Farm is produced by the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, a member of the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. Thank you to our intern, Anna Karns, for her assistance producing this series, and to Noah Earle for the use of his song Fry an Egg for our theme music. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform, and share the show with a friend. Learn more about the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment at fightfactoryfarms.org and support IATP's work at iatp.org/donate.